Somebody who's not a member of this committee, I appreciate the opportunity to put these questions. Thank you, and thank you for your presentations. I first would like to ask to speak to the Commission, please, and to ask you, are you aware, I don't know if you're employed there since 2012, but are you aware that in 2012 Michael O'Leary attacked the regulator for being overstaffed, overpaid, and claimed that Ryanair were a victim of your agency? And if you were aware of that, and what your comment would be on that. So, in other words, 5 years ago now, he saw your regulating agency as a problem, and clearly nowadays it doesn't appear to be a problem, because all of you who speak on behalf of the agency have talked about the sort of partnership and the harmonious relationship and the attempt to work with Ryanair, the attempt to solve the problem. But there's no tone of the attempt to, which I believe is one of your briefs, to implement and apply regulation. There's no tone that that is what you actually try to do with Ryanair. And this is why everybody is making the comparison between yourselves and the CAA in Britain, because the head of the CAA, Andrew Hayne, has made a mark really here, and previously had been accused of light touch regulation by pilots associations and trade unions in Britain. But my God, he stands out markedly beside the record of your agency by insisting that Ryanair did in fact comply with the regulation and did in fact inform the passengers that they were entitled to be rerouted on other airlines. And Mr Hayne has said that in his discussion with Ryanair, in some discourse with Ryanair, Michael O'Leary said to him he is not going to pay for passengers to fly on other airlines. That's against the law. Now, that's a regulation that passengers should have known, that they were entitled to be rerouted on other airlines. And you quoted a lot about the emails that Ryanair sent out and how you had to go and discuss with them and change the language a bit and make the message a bit different. At any stage, did you insist that in that email that they point out to passengers very clearly what the British regulator forced them to point out under threat of enforcement, which is that passengers were entitled to be rerouted on other airlines? Or do you interpret that regulation differently to the CAA? There's a couple of questions just on that. I would also like to agree with Deputy Barry and to say that there's been a shocking low level of light touch regulation in this country on the question of Ryanair. And really, it's summed up for me by Mr Hayne when he says the compliance culture in Ryanair only appears when they're forced into the courts. Their compliance culture is wanting otherwise. And I would like you to comment on that. And I'm not asking you to tear apart Mr Hayne, obviously, but I would like you to comment on those very serious allegations by your counterpart in Britain. For yourselves in the Aviation Authority, you see, at one stage you said that the issue of pilots' contracts has nothing to do with you, it's for someone else. Well, I want to put it to you that it has very much something to do with you, because you have to oversee the health and safety regulations, or the safety at least, of people's participation in flights, both the pilots, the airline themselves, and indeed the passengers, the likes of all of us sitting around and those who may be watching. We would be very concerned that our flights are run safely. And there's a number of issues here to do with the contracts of pilots that you don't seem to think has anything to do with you. And it goes to the heart of why, for 10 years after the regulation was brought in 2008, almost 10 years, Ryanair did not apply the regulation of the annual leave year running from January to December. And you speak to any trade union in the airline industry, and indeed any of the pilots' associations, which we will earlier on, and they will tell you that the 900 hours that were declared safe to work in a year, in a period, were being worked by Ryanair between March and April. Between April and March, excuse me, the other way around. And most of those hours were being packed into the summer. And then hardly any hours were given to pilots in the winter. So you see a big concentration of Ryanair flights in the summer period, and an awful lot of them do not exist during the winter period. Hence Deputy Barry's comment about the type of contract under which pilots work. Now, are you aware of a London School of Economics study carried out with 7,000 pilots across Europe, which is basically looking into pilot fatigue, and where they point out that the type of contract under which pilots work, whether it's precarious, whether it's permanent, or how the hours are managed, very much impacts on the safety of the airline, because pilot fatigue is a problem. If you're not aware of that study, I would recommend that the Aviation Authority makes themselves aware of that study, because it's a very highly recommended study, very comprehensive, as I say, carried out among 7,000 pilots across Europe. The other issue to do with the notification that Ryanair gave, you probably are aware of this, and maybe you could answer for me if you are, that last June they wrote to their pilots and told them, that was June 2016, that they would have to change the leave year around because of this regulation being imposed on them. And it's my understanding from conversations with people in Europe that it was the European Aviation Safety Authority leaned heavily on you guys to make sure that regulation was implemented. Now, I'd like you to comment on that. You talk about discussions with EASA, but I would argue, and I've been told, that they leaned quite heavily on you. And it would seem that they may have had to, because after 10 years, Ryanair and Aer Lingus were the only ones not applying this rule of January to December leave years, and the operation within the 900 hours within that year. So Ryanair told their pilots last June that they were going to apply this, and yet they went ahead and published their 2017 summer schedule. Did it not occur to the Aviation Authority at any point, there's a problem here? These are coming up against a deadline to apply this regulation, and yet they've published their 2017 summer schedule, winter schedule, sold a load of flights. What is going to happen? Now, that I wouldn't say is micromanagement. I would say that you should have been alerted, given the serious change they had to make in terms of the leave year. You should have been alerted automatically to there will be a problem, and this will be a problem for passengers and for health and safety. The responsibility for passengers and their complaints lies with the body that sits beside you, but surely there must be some indication somewhere along the line that these things matter. If they don't, then maybe Michael O'Leary's complaint about being overpaid is fair enough. One other point on health and safety: are you aware of a table of I see now how it's phrased. I better get this right. A secret table detailing Ryanair's tracking of pilots' fuel use was sent to the Minister for Transport some months ago. Are you aware of that? Has the Minister for Transport discussed this with you? Are you concerned at all that there may be pressure put on pilots to fly with less fuel than would otherwise be the norm? Because flying with less fuel makes the flight more economical. You don't spend as much fuel carrying the weight of the fuel itself. And are you aware of any complaints or petitions from pilots in Ryanair to say that they were concerned about being pressurised to cut down on the amount of fuel they carry? If you weren't aware of it, now that I've made you aware of it, are you concerned about that? Does that ring alarm bells with you? And therefore, would you be concerned that the safety of not just the pilots, with the hours I talked about and the fatigue that kicks in, but also the safety of the pilots and the passengers they carry is being compromised because of these shoddy practices? Finally, I just want to ask you one other question, and I'm sorry now for being slow. I've loads of notes here. Just on that period of you gave them a deadline until January 2018 to get their act together, but yet you said you gave them a year, and still they informed their own pilots last June that they had to do this. So that would be a year this June. You gave them more than a year, you gave them almost 2 years because you had those discussions in February of 2016. You gave them almost 2 years, they failed to comply in a proper way, and then they make a bags of it or a mess of it according to themselves. And does this not give you concern as the Civil Aviation Authority about the behaviour of this company, the impact on health and safety, and indeed the impact on I think it's nearly 700,000 passengers now who have been impacted? My God, if Bus Éireann or Dublin bus unions did that, the sky would fall in, according to wider society. It would be an awful thing to happen. But this happens because of the behaviour of a company, and there's hardly a word of criticism. So I think the question of light touch regulation and backing off from Ryanair and having discourse with them rather than imposing regulation on them is a problem with both authorities, and I'd like you to comment on that.
Could I just say before those questions